When you picture the 1950s, what comes to mind? Probably poodle skirts, sock hops, maybe some classic cars, right? But what was it really like to be a student back then? Well, let me tell you, the reality inside the classroom was a whole different world, one that was governed by rules so strict they might actually shock you today.
Just try to imagine it for a second. The bell rings. The hallways are quiet. The classrooms were these hushed sanctuaries. You're learning cursive. You're memorizing multiplication tables. And maybe, just maybe, you're trying to pass a note under the desk, praying you don't get caught. Yeah, this was an era all about order, all about discipline, and a set of expectations that really did shape an entire generation.
But this level of control didn't just happen by accident, so you gotta ask, right? Why? Why was everything so rigid, so incredibly buttoned up? What was driving this intense need for conformity and discipline? Well, the answer is a lot more complex and, frankly, more interesting than you might think.
Okay, so let's start with what you could see. Control in the 1950s classroom really began with appearance. See, the thinking back then was that if you could control how a teenager looked, you could control the teenager. And boy, did they have some very, very specific ideas about what that look should be.
Now this is where it gets fascinating. There was a very clear line drawn in the sand. On one side, you had the proper look. Boys in collared shirts, girls in skirts that fell below the knee. And on the other side, you have what they literally called bad taste. A leather jacket? Oh, no way. That just screamed rebel. Dungarees, what we call jeans, were totally out. And something as small as an ankle bracelet or a sweater that a teacher thought was too tight could get you a one-way ticket to the principal's office.
And believe me, it went way beyond the dress code. I'm talking about teachers literally pulling out rulers to measure girls' hemlines. Can you imagine? Chewing gum was a major offense. It was seen as sloppy and disrespectful. The hallways were for walking quietly, single file, and in a lot of schools, boys and girls sat on completely opposite sides of the classroom, all in the name of reducing distractions.
So it wasn't just about how you looked, it was about everything you did. And if you stepped out of line, well, let's just say the methods for enforcing these rules were swift, they were public, and very often they were physical. If you messed up, there was a system. It might start with a public scolding, right there in front of all your friends. Humiliating. For repeat offenders, you could end up in the infamous dunce chair, a pretty old practice of public shaming that was, believe it or not, still around. And the final stop on that train, corporal punishment. Yep, paddling was a common and totally legal practice pretty much everywhere.
So, how on earth did teachers have this much power? It all came down to this legal idea called in loco parentis. It's Latin, and it basically means in the place of a parent. Think about that for a second. The moment a child walked through the school doors, the teacher legally had the authority of a parent, and their right to discipline was almost never questioned. And I mean, this authority was absolute. You did not question a teacher. That was insubordination, plain and simple. This quote here, it's from an actual educational film from the time, and it just captures that tone perfectly. There's no room for discussion, no debate. The teacher's word was law, period. Now, it's easy for us to look back and just say, well, it was a different time. They had different values. But here's the thing. This incredible level of rigidity, it wasn't just about creating polite students. No, there were much, much bigger forces at play here. Deep-seated anxieties that were shaping the entire American education system. The real reason for this obsession with order and discipline, well, it can pretty much be summed up in one word: Sputnik. The Cold War was casting this long, dark shadow over every single part of American life, and that absolutely included the classroom. To really get the shift, you have to look at this timeline. See, for decades, there was this movement called progressive education, which was all about flexible, child-centered learning. But after World War II, a backlash started building. People started thinking it was too soft, too permissive. And then, bam, October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launches a satellite into space, Sputnik, and America completely freaks out. The question on everyone's mind was, are we falling behind? Is our soft education system to blame? Congress responded with unbelievable force. They authorized over $1 billion to completely remake American education. I mean, $1 billion is a ton of money today. Back then, it was an absolutely astronomical sum. And the crucial clue is right here in the name of the law they passed. It wasn't the Better Schools Act, it was the National Defense Education Act.
That tells you everything you need to know. The goal wasn't just about creating smarter students, it was about creating students who could help America win the Cold War. Education was now officially an instrument of national security. And this, right here, is the key. All of a sudden, a student who sat up straight, who followed every rule, who aced their math and science tests, they weren't just being a good kid anymore. They were being a patriot. The pressure to conform, to be disciplined, to achieve, it was all framed as a vital part of the national defense effort against the Soviets. Your classroom was now a front line in the Cold War.
But, a system that hyper-rigid just can't last forever. It was bound to crack. And ironically, the same kinds of massive societal pressures that created it would eventually be the things that tore it all down, as a new generation started asking some tough questions about the very idea of conformity.
The change started coming from all over the place. You had these landmark court cases like Brown versus Board of Education and Tinker versus Des Moines that started to protect students' civil rights and chip away at the absolute authority of schools. At the same time, the 60s happened. The youth counterculture celebrated individuality, not the lockstep conformity of their parents' generation. So even though the Supreme Court actually upheld corporal punishment in 1977, the culture had already turned against it. The writing was on the wall. The old rules were breaking.
And that brings us all the way to today. The world of the 1950s classroom might seem like ancient history, but that core tension, it's still here. We still debate dress codes, we still debate discipline, and we still argue about the entire purpose of education. Looking back at this era of extreme control is just a powerful reminder that these aren't just school rules, they're a reflection of a society's deepest hopes and fears. And it leaves us with a question we're still trying to answer.